The candles of Almac's assembly rooms burned with their usual brilliance that April evening in 1814, casting golden light across London's most exclusive ballroom. Octavia Hartwell stood beside her father at the entrance, her gloved hands clasped so tightly her fingers ached. The silk of her ivory gown whispered against her legs as she shifted her weight, trying to ignore the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Steady, my dear," her father murmured, his voice gentle but strained. She could feel the tension in his arm where hers rested. They both knew what was coming. Lady Jersey, one of Almac's formidable patronesses, approached with measured steps. Her gaze swept over Octavia, lingering on her hair, silver grey strands carefully arranged in an elegant chignon that had taken her maid hours to perfect. The older woman's lips pursed almost imperceptibly. "Viscountess Hartwell?" Lady Jersey said, her tone honeyed but sharp. "How unexpected. I wasn't aware." She paused, exchanging a glance with Lady Castlereagh behind her. "Are you quite certain the young lady is meant for this particular event? We do host other gatherings more suited to—" "My daughter is 18, Lady Jersey," Viscount Hartwell said, his voice firmer than Octavia had heard it in months. "This is her first season. Her presentation was approved by the Queen herself." Lady Jersey's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. How singular." As they moved past into the ballroom, Octavia felt the familiar burn of humiliation creep up her neck. "At least they didn't suggest I check the widow's tea room," she thought, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Small mercies. The ballroom stretched before them, a sea of pastel gowns and dark evening coats. Other debutantes clustered in groups, their mothers hovering nearby like well-dressed hawks. Octavia caught sight of Lady Dorothea Pemberton, resplendent in pink silk, her golden curls catching the candlelight as she laughed with 3 other young ladies. Beautiful. Normal. Everything Octavia would never be. "Miss Hartwell," the Master of Ceremonies announced, his voice carrying across the room. The music continued, but Octavia felt the shift in attention like a physical thing. Conversations paused. Heads turned. She lifted her chin and walked forward, each step measured and careful, her father's hand steady at her elbow. She'd prepared herself for the stares. What she hadn't prepared for were the whispers, loud enough to be clearly heard. "Good Lord, look at her hair. Is she elderly? Why would they present? Perhaps it's some sort of illness." Lady Dorothea's voice cut through the murmurs, bright and cruel. "How very Gothic, like something from one of those horrid novels. Do you suppose she's actually a witch?" Laughter rippled through the group of debutantes. Octavia's face burned, but she kept walking, kept her expression carefully neutral. She'd learned, over the past 2 years, since her hair had transformed from chestnut, brown to this premature silver, that showing pain only invited more. The dancing began. Octavia stood beside a marble column, her father having retreated to the card room after several awkward minutes of standing with her. She watched as young men approached other debutantes, bowing, requesting dances. They passed by her as if she were part of the architecture, present but invisible, noteworthy only for her strangeness. A young gentleman started toward her, his steps purposeful. Hope flared in Octavia's chest for one brilliant moment. Then his friend caught his arm, whispered something, and they both veered away toward a brunette in blue. Of course, she should leave, should claim a headache and spare her father the embarrassment. But something stubborn in her refused to run. Let them stare, let them whisper. She would stand here with her head high until the wretched evening ended. Across the ballroom, Lucian Ashford, Duke of Greystone, stood with a group of gentleman friends, nodding absently at Lord Pemberton's hunting story. At 26, he'd grown accustomed to these events, the artificial conversations, the calculating glances from ambitious mothers, the tedious predictability of it all. And then the fox doubled back toward, "Greystone, are you listening?" Lucian murmured, his attention snagged by something across the room. A young woman stood near one of the columns, her posture rigidly perfect, her ivory gown simple but elegant, but it was her hair that seized his attention like a fist around his heart. Silver grey, caught in the candlelight, arranged in a style his mother had favoured. His breath caught. For a moment, he was 7 years old again, watching his mother descend the stairs of their country estate, her white hair, premature like this young woman's, gleaming in the afternoon sun. He remembered the whispers that had followed her everywhere, the way she'd smiled despite them, the way he'd hidden behind his father's legs because he was ashamed of his own mother. "I say, that's the Hartwell girl," Lord Pemberton said, following Lucian's gaze. "Peculiar thing, isn't it? Dorothea says she's barely 18, but looks ready for the grave." Something cold and sharp twisted in Lucian's chest. He had said nothing when society mocked his mother. He'd been a child, but he'd said nothing. He'd let her face their cruelty alone. "Excuse me," he said, setting down his champagne glass. "Greystone, where are you?" But Lucian was already walking, his stride long and purposeful. The room seemed to quiet as he moved, conversations dying like candles snuffed one by one. He was aware of the attention, aware that every eye in the ballroom was tracking his movement, but he didn't care. The young woman didn't notice him approaching. She was staring at the floor, her jaw set with visible tension, her gloved hands clasped before her. Up close, he could see she was young, very young, with delicate features and eyes the colour of storm clouds, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with convention. "Miss?" he said, stopping before her. She didn't look up. He tried again, gentler. "Miss, would you do me the honour of this dance?" Her head jerked up, eyes wide with shock. She glanced around, clearly expecting to find he was addressing someone else. She looked back at him, confusion clear on her face. "Your Grace, I think—" "I am asking you," Lucian said, extending his hand. His voice was quiet but firm. "If you would grant me the honour." The ballroom had gone absolutely silent. Octavia could feel hundreds of eyes on them, could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. This had to be a mistake, some sort of cruel jest. The Duke of Greystone, the most eligible bachelor in England, couldn't possibly be asking her to dance. But his hand remained extended, steady and patient. And his eyes, dark, blue, intense, held something that looked almost like recognition. Sadness. "Yes," she heard herself say, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Your Grace." She placed her trembling hand in his, and he led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra, after a stunned pause, began a waltz. The first steps of the waltz were agony. Octavia's body was rigid with tension, every muscle locked as the Duke of Greystone guided her through the movements. Her mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. A wager, a joke, pity so profound it demanded action. "You dance beautifully," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She nearly stumbled. "Your Grace, I don't understand." "What troubles you?" His hand at her waist was gentle but secure, keeping her in perfect position even as her feet threatened to tangle. "Why are you doing this?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Octavia felt heat flood her face. "Forgive me, that was honest," he finished, something almost like amusement touching his eyes. "I appreciate honesty, Miss Hartwell. Octavia Hartwell." She forced herself to meet his gaze, drawing on the defences she'd built over 2 years of whispers and rejection. "And I can only assume you've lost a rather significant wager, Your Grace." He was quiet for a moment, studying her face as they turned. On the contrary, Miss Hartwell, I believe I may have won something this evening." His tone was serious, without a trace of mockery. Octavia felt something shift in her chest, a tiny crack in the armour she'd wrapped around her heart. "The orchestra is competent," he continued, as if they were discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "Though I've heard better. Do you enjoy music?" It was such an ordinary question, not about her hair, not about her appearance, just normal, as if she were any other young woman at her first ball. "I do," she said carefully. "I play pianoforte, though not terribly well. My sister Eleanor is the talented one." "You have a sister?" "Yes, she's—" Octavia caught herself, surprised at how easily she'd begun to respond. "She's married, living in Somerset now. I miss her dreadfully." "Older or younger?" "Older by 4 years. She writes to me often, but it's not the same as having her near." They talked through the rest of the waltz. Simple conversation about siblings, about music, about nothing of consequence. But Octavia felt herself relaxing despite herself, felt the rigid set of her shoulders easing as the Duke proved to be a surprisingly engaging conversational partner. When the music ended, he bowed over her hand. "Thank you, Miss Hartwell. This has been the most pleasant dance of my evening." Before she could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of gentlemen near the refreshment table. Octavia stood frozen on the dance floor, aware that every person in the room was staring at her with open speculation. Lady Dorothea materialised at her elbow, all false sweetness. "My goodness, Miss Hartwell, what an unexpected development. Tell me, did His Grace mention anything about charitable works? He's known to be quite generous to unfortunate causes." The barb hit its mark, but Octavia kept her expression neutral. "He mentioned nothing of the sort, Lady Dorothea. We discussed music." "How mundane." Lady Dorothea's smile was sharp. "Well, do enjoy your moment. I'm sure the Duke was simply being kind. He could hardly ignore such a spectacle, could he?" The following days brought a confusion of emotions Octavia had never experienced. Invitations began arriving at the Hartwell household. Tea with Lady Sefton, a music-hall at the Cavendish home, a morning ride in Hyde Park with the Worthington family. Things that had seemed impossible a week ago. "It's because of the Duke," her father said over breakfast, scanning another cream-coloured card. "His attention has made you acceptable." Octavia pushed eggs around her plate. Her appetite vanished. For how long? Until he moves on to someone more appropriate. "Octavia." "I'm not foolish, Papa. I know what I am, what I look like. One dance doesn't change that." But when Lucian Ashford called at their modest townhouse 2 days later, requesting the honour of taking Miss Hartwell for a carriage ride through Hyde Park, with proper chaperonage, naturally, Octavia found herself agreeing before her rational mind could object. The ride began in awkward silence. Octavia sat ramrod straight on the velvet seat, her maid positioned decorously in the rear-facing seat across from them, staring pointedly out the window to give them what privacy propriety allowed. "You seem uncomfortable," Lucian observed as they entered the park gates. "Have I done something to offend you?" "No, Your Grace. You've been nothing but kind." "But you don't trust kindness." It wasn't a question. Octavia turned to look at him. Really look at him. In the afternoon light, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight shadow along his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the collar, despite obvious attempts to tame it. He was handsome, certainly, but it was the intensity in his expression that caught her attention. He looked at her as if she mattered. "I've learned that kindness often comes with conditions," she said quietly, "or expectations I cannot fulfill." "Such as?" such as gratitude that borders on obligation, such as pretending to be something I'm not. She lifted her chin. I won't dye my hair, Your Grace. Not for you, not for society. If that's what you're hoping, I wouldn't dream of it. His response was immediate, almost fierce. Your hair is... He stopped, seeming to search for words. It's unusual, yes, but why should unusual be inferior? They rode in silence for several moments, the sounds of other carriages and horses providing a backdrop to Octavia's racing thoughts. My mother had white hair from the age of 25, Lucian said finally, his voice low. Some condition the physicians never properly explained. She was beautiful, intelligent, accomplished. None of it mattered. Society saw only the peculiarity. The flaw. Octavia's breath caught. I'm sorry. She died when I was 15. And his jaw tightened. I was ashamed of her. Not always, not consciously. But there were moments. Moments when I wished she looked like other mothers. When I was embarrassed by the stares and whispers. I never told her I loved her the way she was. I let her face their cruelty alone. The pain in his voice was raw, honest. Octavia felt something crack deeper in her chest, felt the instinctive understanding of someone who'd suffered similar wounds. You were a child, she said softly. Children cannot be expected to... I should have been braver. He turned to her and she saw ghosts in his eyes. She deserved better than my cowardice. The carriage rolled past the Serpentine, sunlight glinting off the water. Octavia wrestled with herself, with the walls she'd built so carefully. Then, slowly, she spoke. I was 16 when it started. Just a few grey strands at first. I thought perhaps I'd gone out in the sun without a bonnet too often. She traced the pattern on her glove, not looking at him. Within 3 months, all of it was silver. The physicians had no explanation. My mother cried. My father grew quieter. Eleanor? Her voice caught. Eleanor told me I was still beautiful, but I could see it in her eyes. The worry, the fear that I'd never find a husband, never have the life she had. Do you believe her? Your sister? That I'm beautiful? Octavia's laugh was bitter. I have eyes, Your Grace. I see what others see. A girl who appears elderly before her time. A curiosity at best, a cautionary tale at worst. I see something else. His tone made her look up. He was gazing at her with that same intensity, but softer now, almost tender. I see courage, he said quietly. I see someone who came to Almack's knowing exactly what awaited her, and stood there with her head high anyway. I see wit sharp, enough to match cruelty with humour. I see... He paused. I see the woman my mother would have wanted me to champion. The woman I failed to defend when I had the chance. Your Grace, Lucian, please. The intimacy of the request stole her breath. We barely know each other. Then let's remedy that. He smiled, and it transformed his face, chasing away the shadows. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, are you fond of riding? Because I've been told you have an interest in horses, though perhaps not much skill. Despite herself, Octavia laughed. A real laugh, startled out of her by his teasing tone. Who told you that? Your father may have mentioned you once terrified a very patient mare by mounting from the wrong side. I was 14, and she was fine after several lumps of sugar. I have a docile gelding who might suit you better, if you're brave enough to try again. The challenge in his eyes was unmistakable. Octavia felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. I'll consider it, she said, fighting a smile. Though I make no promises about your horse's safety. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of carefully chaperoned meetings. Lucian called at the Hartwell townhouse 3 times a week. They rode in Hyde Park during the fashionable morning hours, drawing stares and whispers that gradually shifted from shocked to speculatively interested. He brought her books of poetry, debated politics and philosophy with a respect for her opinions that left her breathless. He made her laugh, taught her that joy could exist alongside the wariness she'd carried for so long. There was the morning he tried to teach her to ride properly, his hands gentle on her waist as he helped her mount, his voice patient as he coached her through the basics. She'd been terrible at it, nervous and stiff, and when the horse had finally tossed her gently into a soft bank of grass, they'd both ended up laughing until tears ran down their faces. "I told you I was hopeless," she gasped, accepting his hand to pull her up. "Nonsense, you're merely creatively challenged when it comes to equestrian pursuits." His eyes had been dancing with mirth, and she'd been struck by how young he looked when he smiled like that, how different from the serious Duke who navigated society's demands with careful precision. Other moments were quieter, more profound. The afternoon in her father's library when she'd shared her love of history, and he'd listened with genuine interest as she explained the complexities of medieval succession laws. The evening at a musicale when she'd played pianoforte, her fingers clumsy with nerves, and he'd told her afterward that her music had moved him, not despite its imperfection, but because of the emotion she'd poured into it. "You play like someone who understands loss," he'd said, his voice low, "like someone who's learned that beauty and pain often share the same space." The tension between them grew, with each meeting, his hand lingering on hers a moment too long when he helped her from the carriage, the way his gaze would drop to her lips when she spoke, the heat that flooded through her when he stood close, the scent of him, sandalwood and something uniquely his, making her dizzy. But even as something precious began to bloom between them, Octavia couldn't quite silence the voice of doubt. It came to a head after a summons from Lucian's aunt, Lady Cordelia Ashford. Lucia had mentioned the meeting to Octavia during their last ride, his jaw tight with tension. "She wants to discuss my plans for marriage." "Oh." Octavia had kept her voice carefully neutral, though her heart had plummeted. "Of course, it's expected that you'll marry well." "That's not..." He'd stopped, frustration clear in his expression. "This isn't about expectation. This is about what I want." But he'd gone to the meeting anyway, and Octavia had spent the afternoon trying not to imagine the conversation. She didn't have to imagine for long. Lady Dorothea cornered her at Lady Sefton's tea party 2 days later, her smile venomous. "My dear Miss Hartwell, you must be so pleased with the Duke's attention." She sipped her tea delicately. "Though I wonder, have you considered why such an eligible bachelor would suddenly take interest in someone so unusual?" "I haven't speculated on His Grace's motivations." Octavia kept her tone cool, though her hands trembled slightly on her cup. "No? How peculiar. Everyone else has." Lady Dorothea leaned closer, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that somehow carried to the nearby guests. "They say he acts from guilt, you know. Something about his mother. I don't know the details. It was all rather sad, but apparently you remind him of her. How very convenient for you." The words hit like physical blows. Octavia forced herself to remain composed, to finish her tea and make appropriate conversation before excusing herself early with a claimed headache. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt, once planted, grew rapidly. Every kind word from Lucian, every gentle touch, every moment of seeming affection, all of it suddenly looked different through the lens of Lady Dorothea's insinuations. He was seeking absolution. She was a convenient proxy for the mother he'd failed to defend. Their connection, the thing she'd begun to treasure, to hope might be real, was nothing more than his attempt to ease a guilty conscience. The thought made her physically ill. When Lucian called the next day, she was distant, her responses polite but cool. He noticed immediately. Octavia? He used her given name now when they were relatively private. What's wrong? Have I offended you? Not at all, Your Grace. She emphasized the formal address deliberately. I simply think perhaps we've been seeing rather too much of each other. People will talk. People are already talking. I don't care. Well, I do. She stood, forcing him to stand as, well, by the rules of propriety. I appreciate your kindness these past weeks, but I think it's time we both return to our proper circles. Confusion and hurt flashed across his face. I don't understand. Yesterday we were... What changed? Everything. Nothing. She couldn't tell him. Couldn't bear to hear him confirm Lady Dorothea's cruel truth. Couldn't stand to see pity in his eyes. Nothing changed. That's precisely the problem. She rang for the butler. Thank you for calling, Your Grace. I wish you well. He left, clearly baffled and hurt. Octavia returned to her room and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to cry before composing herself, pushing the pain down deep where it belonged. It was better this way. Better to end it now than to watch him eventually realize she could never be what he truly needed. Better than being a stand-in for a ghost. The Havisham Ball, 3 weeks later, was the event of the season. Everyone who mattered would attend, and those who didn't would spend the following weeks pretending they had. Octavia had initially declined the invitation, but her father had insisted. You cannot hide forever, my dear. You've done nothing wrong. Except fall in love with a man who saw her as penance, she thought bitterly. But she'd allowed her maid to dress her in a gown of deep sapphire silk that Eleanor had sent from Somerset, and arranged her silver hair in an elaborate style that made her look, if not beautiful, at least striking. The Havisham ballroom was magnificent, crystal chandeliers casting rainbow prisms across walls hung with silk, flowers arranged in elaborate displays, the orchestra tucked into an alcove that amplified their sound perfectly. Octavia stood near a pillar again, old habits dying hard, watching dancers whirl past in a blur of colour and light. She'd seen Lucian across the room earlier, surrounded by admirers as always. He'd looked at her, his expression unreadable, but she'd turned away, unable to bear whatever she might see in his eyes. Miss Hartwell. Lady Dorothea's voice was honey-sweet poison. How lovely you look this evening. That colour is quite bold for someone of your distinctive colouring. Thank you, Lady Dorothea. Octavia kept her tone neutral, wary. I wanted to tell you how sorry I am about the Duke, but truly, it's for the best, isn't it? A man in his position needs someone who can... Well, you understand. She gestured vaguely. Someone normal. Octavia's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Oh dear, I've upset you. Here, let me fetch you some punch. Lady Dorothea reached for a glass from a passing servant's tray, her movements exaggerated and deliberately clumsy. The ruby liquid splashed across Octavia's bodice, ice cold and shocking. Oh no! Lady Dorothea's voice carried across the nearby section of the ballroom. I'm so terribly sorry, though honestly, Miss Hartwell, with your hair I quite mistook you for one of the chaperone matrons. An understandable error, surely. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Octavia stood frozen, punch dripping from her gown, humiliation burning through her like wildfire. This was it, the moment she'd always known would come. The reminder that she would never truly belong, never be accepted, never be anything but an oddity to be mocked. She should leave, should run. But her feet wouldn't move, rooted to the floor by the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every moment of rejection she'd endured. Then the orchestra stopped. The sudden silence was jarring. Octavia looked up, confused, and saw dancers pausing mid-step, conversations dying as everyone turned toward the orchestra alcove. Lucian stood there, having ascended the small platform where the musicians sat. His expression was intense, almost fierce, and his gaze was fixed directly on her. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice rang out, carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. "I apologize for the interruption, but there is something I must say, something I should have said weeks ago." Octavia's heart hammered against her ribs. What was he doing? "Many of you knew my mother, the late Duchess of Greystone. Some of you may remember that she had white hair from a relatively young age, a peculiarity that society found endlessly fascinating." His tone was sharp now, cutting. "I was a child when she died, and I carry a shame that has haunted me ever since. I never defended her. I never told her that I loved her exactly as she was. I allowed society's cruelty to go unchallenged because I was too cowardly to stand against it." The ballroom was utterly still. Octavia could barely breathe. "I cannot change my past," Lucian continued, his gaze never leaving her face. "But I can choose differently now. I can be the man I should have been, the man my mother deserved." He descended from the platform, walking slowly toward her through the crowd that parted like water before him. "Miss Octavia Hartwell," he said, his voice quieter now but still carrying in the profound silence, "has more courage in her smallest finger than most people possess in their entire beings. She faces each day, knowing exactly how she'll be judged, knowing the whispers and stares that await her, and she holds her head high anyway. She is intelligent, kind, witty." "Lucian," Octavia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He stopped before her, close enough that she could see the emotion burning in his eyes. "I have to tell you, and everyone here, that you have taught me what real beauty looks like. It looks like strength that doesn't need armor. It looks like grace under cruelty. It looks like someone who plays pianoforte with such emotion it brings tears to my eyes, who laughs when she falls off horses, who debates philosophy with a passion that makes me want to listen to her voice for the rest of my life." He dropped to one knee, and Octavia heard gasps echo through the ballroom. "I am not acting from guilt or pity," Lucian said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm acting from love, desperate, consuming, all-encompassing love for a woman who deserves so much better than me. But if you'll have me, if you can forgive my cowardice these past weeks, when I should have made this declaration sooner, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." He pulled a ring from his pocket, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, gleaming in the candlelight. "Octavia Hartwell, will you marry me?" The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Octavia was aware of hundreds of eyes on them, aware that Lady Dorothea stood frozen nearby, her face white with shock, aware that this moment would define how society saw her forever. But more than any of that, she was aware of Lucian kneeling before her with his heart laid bare, with love and hope and fear all written across his face. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, her voice gaining strength, "Yes, Your Grace, I will." He stood, sliding the ring onto her finger, with hands that trembled slightly, and then he was kissing her, properly scandalous for such a public venue, but no one seemed to care. The ballroom erupted in applause, though whether it was genuine or merely prudent, Octavia couldn't tell and didn't care. When they finally broke apart, Lucian kept her hand firmly in his, turning to face the assembled crowd. "Anyone who has issue with my choice is welcome to take their concerns elsewhere," he said, his tone pleasant but with steel beneath it. "Preferably far from London. I find I've lost patience for the superficial judgments that pass for society in certain circles." Lady Dorothea, her face mottled with fury and humiliation, turned and fled from the ballroom. Several of her friends followed, but many more remained, a new calculation in their expressions as they regarded Octavia, the future Duchess of Greystone. Lucian led her to the terrace, away from the crowd, into the cool evening air. Octavia's hands were shaking, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. "You really?" Her voice broke. "You meant all of that?" "Every word." He cupped her face gently, his thumbs wiping away the tears still streaming down her cheeks. "I've been a fool, Octavia. I should have declared myself weeks ago, but I was afraid you didn't return my feelings, afraid I was asking too much. Lady Dorothea said—" Octavia swallowed hard. "She said you were acting from guilt, that I reminded you of your mother, and you were seeking absolution." Pain flashed across his face. "You do remind me of her, but not in the way that cruel woman implied." He took both her hands, holding them carefully. "You remind me of her strength, her grace, her refusal to let the world's judgment diminish her. And yes, being with you has helped me understand her better, helped me forgive myself a little for my failures. But that's not why I love you." "Why then?" She needed to hear it, needed to believe it. "Because you make me laugh. Because you challenge me intellectually and see through my pretensions. Because when you play music, you put your whole heart into it, even knowing you'll make mistakes." His smile was tender. "Because you fell off a horse and laughed at yourself instead of crying. Because you're brave enough to walk into rooms full of people who judge you and remain yourself anyway. Because," his voice dropped, "because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Because you've become essential to my happiness." Octavia felt the last of her walls crumble. "I love you too," she whispered. "I tried not to, tried to convince myself it was better to walk away, but—" He kissed her again, soft and sweet, tasting of champagne and promise. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I will never ask you to change," he murmured. "Not your hair, not your spirit, not anything about you. You're perfect, exactly as you are." "I'm not perfect." "No, but you're perfect for me." They stood together on the terrace, the sounds of the ball resuming behind them, the night air cool on their flushed faces. Octavia looked at the ring on her finger, sapphire catching the light, and felt something she thought lost forever. Hope. "My sister will be insufferable when she hears about this," she said, a laugh bubbling up through the tears. "She always said I'd find someone who appreciated me." "Your sister sounds wise." "She is. You'll like her." "I look forward to meeting her, though I confess I'm more interested in convincing my future wife to set a wedding date. How do you feel about June?" "June?" Octavia blinked. "That's only 2 months away." "Too long, but I suppose I can endure it for propriety's sake." His smile was mischievous. "Unless you'd prefer to scandalise society further and elope to Gretna Green." "Lucerne!" "What? I'm already known as the Duke who proposed on an orchestra platform. We might as well be thoroughly shocking." She laughed, the sound bright and free, and realised she felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of judgment, of constantly defending herself against the world's cruelty, had lifted. Not because society had changed, she had no illusions there, but because she had found someone who stood beside her, who chose her deliberately and publicly, who loved her not despite her differences, but for the whole of who she was. "June," she said decisively, "and a proper wedding. I want Eleanor to be there, and I want—" She hesitated. "What do you want?" "I want to wear my hair down, not hidden or tucked away. I want everyone to see it." His smile was brilliant. "That," he said, kissing her once more, "sounds perfect." They married in June, in a ceremony at St. George's that was attended by much of London society, some out of genuine affection, many out of curiosity, a few out of obligation. Octavia wore her silver hair in loose waves crowned with white roses, and she had never felt more beautiful than when she saw the look in Lucian's eyes. As she walked down the aisle, Eleanor had cried through the entire ceremony, and afterward had pulled Octavia into a fierce embrace. "I told you," she'd whispered, "I told you there was someone who would see you." Life as the Duchess of Greystone brought its own challenges. There would always be those who whispered, who judged, who saw only the surface strangeness. But Octavia found she cared less with each passing day. She had Lucian, who loved her with a constancy that never wavered. She had found her courage, the ability to stand in rooms full of judgment and remain wholly herself. And on the nights when doubt crept in, when old insecurities threatened to resurface, Lucian would take her hand and remind her of what he'd said on that terrace, that she had taught him what real beauty looked like. It looked like strength that didn't need armour. It looked like grace under cruelty. It looked like choosing to love and be loved exactly as you are. It looked, Octavia discovered, like hope fulfilled.